Hello, I am so excited to be here at DASA Connect 2023. I am so excited. By the way, my name is Neil Magsamble. I'm a transformation architect, executive leadership coach, author, and just recently I am now a DASA approved trainer. So very, very excited about this partnership with DASA. And my company is Envision Consulting LLC. I'm so glad that you decided to join us today because what we're going to talk about in this session is DevOps, maximizing human potential. I want to talk about how when we implement DevOps practices, principles, ideas, we can help people maximize their potential. Now, before I do that, I actually want to share what happens when you don't do DevOps and how that doesn't maximize potential. Well, what do you mean? Well, let me take you back let me take you down memory lane and let me take you back a few years. I remember we would do deployments on the weekends. And quite honestly, the reason why we would do our deployments, the reason why we would do a major release on the weekends was because we didn't trust our release process and we thought that something was going to inevitably go wrong. And because it would go wrong, we didn't want to disrupt our customers. We didn't want to disrupt business. Really, we didn't want to experience any loss of money. So we would do this in the wee early morning hours on a Saturday or a Sunday, so to least disrupt our business. And I remember getting all kind of phone calls. I remember being up at night. I remember getting email after email after email on weekends. And it was so laborious. It was so arduous. And I dreaded me, my team, everyone dreaded those big release weekends. I mean, we were just all anxious and we were all upset, and things would break inevitably, and things would just break down. And we were like, oh my goodness. Now, I had a bright idea. I thought, you know what? Maybe things would be better if I got a Blackberry. Well, unfortunately, the emails kept coming. And that BlackBerry would just go off on alerts and it would constantly be ringing and buzzing. And I mean, I wanted to take that thing and I wanted to throw it across the room. See, it wasn't the BlackBerry, it wasn't the device that I was using that was the problem. The problem was we were using antiquated ways of deploying software. Now, oftentimes these ways were very elaborate manual processes. And the problem with elaborate manual processes is that you need elaborate manual verification steps to make sure you're doing your processes correctly. And then what ends up happening is you create large batches, long lead times, lots of room for manual errors, and a whole lot of sleepless weekends. Now, I actually mapped out the software development and deployment process of a company. And here's what it looked like. So at first, what they had to do was they had to make sure that their testing was complete. And then after their testing was complete, they had to make sure they did their change request documentation. And once they did their change request documentation, then they had to make sure that the tech leads would approve it. And then after the tech leads would approve it, then what would happen is you had to get it ready for CAB, Change Approval Board. And then once you did that, of course, they can't approve it right then and there. They can only do that offline. And then after that, and then only after that is when you can start scheduling your deployment. Now, those are the process steps it takes in order to deploy this thing. However, in between each of those steps, there was some lag time. And you can see the lag time there. And what ended up happening was this entire process could be done in about a day. However, because of the lag time in between each step, our total lead time took almost a week. So that meant we spent 79% of our time waiting and 21% of the time doing actual work. And unfortunately, all this was to go to staging or pre-prod. If you wanted to go to production, the process looked like this. You had to get your list together and you had to make a formal request to even get into production. And then what you had to do was you had to go take your security scans. And then from there, what had to happen is you had to do your change request, your formal documentation, and then of course tech your tech group had to approve it, and then you had to go through your security scans, and then you had to get business owner approval, and then after business owner approval, of course they can't approve it then. They've got to do it offline, and then you had to make sure you went to change approval board, and they've got to make sure that your security, all of these things, and of course they can't approve it then. They've got to wait offline. And what ended up happening was this entire process could take about 3 or 4 days if you just look at the process steps. However, if you look at the lag time between each of these steps, that meant our entire lead time for this whole process you see in front of you took over a month. It took nearly a month to do this. So we spent 84% of our time waiting and only 16% of the time doing actual work. And God forbid at one of these approvals, you don't get the approval. Well, that could delay your entire release, and you may have to wait another month minimum in order to get your stuff to production. See, what happens in situations like this is that we relegate developers to more process pushers. They're not pushing code to production, they're spending more time dealing with process. And inevitably, having to deal with all of these arduous processes, they get behind. Management doesn't like that, so what ends up happening? They start yelling at the developers. And not only that, they think, you know what, in order to get the developers to work harder, to work more hours, to work weekends, and all of those things, let's have them do status meetings, right? So now think about this. Not only do we have them doing these elaborate manual processes, elaborate manual verification steps, now they've got to spend time away from development, and they've got to spend time getting PowerPoints together for these status meetings. No wonder people can't get anything done. This is not how you develop people's potential. And by the way, I have a real pet peeve is when we're in these status meetings, we refer to people as resources. And really, what oftentimes they mean is that they're not just resources, they're expendable resources. It's no wonder that research from Gary Hamel, a professor at the London School of Business, conducted, and he found that 69% of employees disagree with the statement, I have the opportunity to do what I do best every day. Think about that. Nearly 7 out of every 10 employee at companies feel like they are not tapping into their potential. And now, every leader I've ever worked with, every executive, CIO, etc., they've always said, we want our company to be innovative. We want an innovative company. We want to promote innovation. However, the research shows that 75% of the people do not feel like they can be innovative at their job. So again, nearly 8 out of every 10 employee feels like they cannot be innovative. DevOps can help this. I love what Dr. Nicole Forsgren in her book Accelerate says. Computers perform repetitive tasks. People solve problems. One important strategy to reduce the cost of pushing out changes, let's take those arduous, elaborate, unwieldy, repetitive work that takes a long time, things like regression testing, software deployments, those type of things, and let's invest in simplifying and automating this work. That's where DevOps comes in. DevOps does this. See, what DevOps does, it enables people and frees them up to do higher problem solving work, higher value problem solving work. So instead of having people do all these repetitive tasks and all of those different things, let's have them focus on what they do best. Let's maximize their potential to do creative problem solving. Let's maximize their potential to be able to look at our companies and our customers' problems and figure out unique and creative ways to help solve those problems. And we can do this by improving the design of our systems and the products that we produce in response to feedback. Well, what do you mean? So Instead of all of those unwieldy processes that I mentioned earlier, instead of our processes looking like this, let's make them look like this. Let's kind of streamline our processes, and not only streamline it, but let's automate it. Let's use some automated DevOps principles, ideas, and let's use DevOps to streamline our processes and automate those processes. What happens now is that when developers develop something, going through this automated process by automating your version control, your build, your testing, your deployments, etc., what happens is that speeds up their ability to get feedback. Now, we can get feedback in a production environment. We can get feedback from our customers or possibly a subset of customers now that if we use DevOps correctly. And what that does is that allows us to see how the system truly behaves in a production environment. It allows us to see how the system can behave in the hands of our customers. And we can see, is the functionality that we're delivering, is it giving us the results that we're wanting to? Yes or no? And the great thing about DevOps is that we can pivot much faster. We can make changes faster. What it does is it increases our speed of these learning cycles. People can learn faster. People can learn faster. They can make changes faster. People, instead of taking days, weeks, sometimes even months, this can be done in hours. I worked with a company that did this at one of their departments with one of their groups, and they literally experienced an 825% increase in productivity. 825% increase. Now, my colleagues thought, you know what? Leadership is never going to believe 825%. So they actually had to fudge the numbers and say, it was like an 100% increase in productivity, right? They actually had to lower that number just so that leadership would believe them. And that hits on something that research finds very interesting. They found the biggest predictor of an organization's application development practices was cultural, not technical. So, in other words, high trust, low blame cultures focused on performance were nearly twice more likely to have above average adoption of these practices that we've been speaking about. So if you have these type of cultures, if you have this type of environment, people are twice as likely to adopt these practices and be successful as compared to low trust, high blame cultures focused on power or rules. Now, sociologist Dr. Ron Westrom has three typologies of organizational culture. The first one is a pathological, power-oriented culture where there's low cooperation. Messengers are shot. If you deliver bad news, that is unheard of. That's unacceptable. Responsibilities are shirked. See, when you work in this very manual-intensive environment and a very siloed environment, it's very difficult to know who is responsible for what. So people don't want that responsibility because they don't want to get blamed. And bridging is discouraged. So in other words, we don't want to bridge these silos in these type of pathological power-oriented cultures. And God forbid you fail, failure leads to blaming, leads to scapegoating. And novelty or innovation is absolutely crushed. People cannot innovate in this type of environment. And then you have a bureaucratic or a rule-oriented. There's some cooperation. Messengers are neglected. They have very narrow responsibilities. Hey, this is my area. That's it. Don't ask me for anything else. This is all I'm going to do. Bridging is tolerated. It's okay if you talk to other silos. Definitely not encouraged. And failure leads to justice. And novelty, innovation, if you innovate with something, it's just going to lead to more problems. Now, the third culture is called a generative culture. And this is where you can get high performance. This is where people can maximize their potential. You have high cooperation. Messengers are trained. Risks are shared. We create a risk-taking environment where we can take risks together. And if you do DevOps, we can minimize those risks. And we encourage people to work with others. Bridging is encouraged. Failure leads to inquiry. Years ago, Silicon Valley here in the US used to say fail fast. I like the term learn fast. Let's get those fast learning cycles. And in this type of environment, that's when you can get innovation. Novelty is implemented. In my experience, These first two cultures are more like a Venn diagram in many companies, and we're trying to shift them to this generative culture. Now, if you have this Western organizational culture, if you have this generative culture, of course, that's going to help your software delivery performance and it's going to help your overall organizational performance. You know, in the DevOps Agile world, we're always talking about culture, 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 right? We got to change the culture so that we can see better benefits. However, according to research from Dr. Forsgren, I found it amazing is that when I was reading her research, if we implement DevOps, if we implement these DevOps principles and practices, if we implement lean management, that can actually be a precursor to culture. I thought I had it backwards. I thought if we get a better culture, we can get better results. But see, if we use DevOps, what happens is that can actually be a catalyst to help with the culture. She goes on to say that you can act your way to a better culture by implementing these DevOps practices in tech organizations, just like you can do in manufacturing. So if we implement these practices, if we implement these ideas, if we implement these principles, what happens is that can help change the culture. And of course, if we change the culture, then we can get better software delivery performance and organizational performance. Now, research has found that teams that did well at DevOps, at continual delivery, they achieved the following outcomes. They had strong identification with the organization they work for. Well, what do you mean? See, sociologists and psychologists have a term called the looking glass theory. In other words, our view of ourselves comes from how others perceive us. So if a company is saying, you know what, you are a valuable resource, Mr. or Ms. Developer. You are a valuable resource. We're going to give you the tools, the practices. We're going to implement DevOps. So that way you don't have to do all of these tedious manual processes, but you can do what you do best. You can engage in that creative problem solving. See, when companies show them how important people are, what happens is they start building the strong identification. They're proud to work for that organization. They're proud to say that they're a developer, a tester, a software engineer. They have the best tools. They have the best practices implemented through DevOps. That gives them a sense of pride. And of course, as mentioned, it creates a generative performance-oriented culture, and organizations achieve higher levels of software delivery performance. They can do things like get faster time to market with shorter lead times. They can deploy frequently. They can deploy as often as their consumers can consume whatever it is that they want to deploy. And God forbid something breaks down, they have faster time to restore service, so they don't have to do things like being up all night on a weekend. And they have lower change fail rates. In other words, they're delivering higher quality things. Stuff breaks less often. Even better, research found that improvements in continuous deployment or DevOps brought payoffs in the way that work felt. So in other words, when you do this, people have less deployment pain and they have less burnout. And guess what? Less burnout leads to less turnover. Companies spend millions of US dollars on turnover. It's hard to keep good talent. So there's millions and millions of US dollars spent trying to replace turnover. But see, if we do these practices that we've been talking about, there's less chance of people of getting that turnover. Investments in technology are also investments in people. And these investments will make our technology processes more sustainable. We'll have longer lived teams. We'll have sustainable teams. We can attain a sustainable pace. We can be very predictable. We'll know exactly when we can deliver things. And if things fail, again, we have faster recovery time, etc. Now, let me give you a real life example. So I worked with a team one time where, of course, they had a coding environment, they had a test environment, they had a staging environment, and a production environment. And within each of these environments, there were all of these process steps just to provision and use it. And the problem was there were numerous layers of approvals. I'm like, do you really need a vice president to approve a coding environment for a developer? Really? Are you serious? But it had numerous layers of approvals, minimal visibility, and it caused all kinds of internal swirl. And the problem is that because these things were so complicated and it was so arduous, it was very difficult to know who to blame. You had testers blaming developers, and then you had people blaming the tech lead. Tech lead would blame the architect. Everyone blamed the business because they kept telling them to go faster because they were trying to produce code in this kind of ridiculous environment. I said, we have to stop this madness. Okay? We have got to stop this madness. Automation is no longer a luxury, it is absolutely necessary. We have got to implement some DevOps practices. We've got to do some automated testing. Let's shift left with our testing. Let's shift left with how we do things because this is utterly madness. Every time we would plan a sprint, a couple days later, something would break and they would have to fix things that they pushed into production weeks or months ago. And it was constantly like that. We take one step forward, 5 steps back. I said, look, we have got to do this. So guess what? They started doing behavior-driven development. They started automating some of their pipelines. And I'll never forget, they implemented these practices. And I happened to go on vacation one time. And when I came back, I was a little nervous. And I was talking to the team. I said, how things going? They're like, actually really good. I said, really? They said, yeah, we delivered to our customer and it was pretty good. They liked it. I'm like, that's great. You know what happened? Because they implemented DevOps practices and principles, there was nothing to break down. There wasn't anything to blame people for. So they actually started getting along better. They started getting along better. So they went from one of the most toxic, dysfunctional teams I've ever worked with to all of a sudden now they were a cohesive, higher performing team. Now, I love what Harvard researcher Dr. Sean Acor said. He said, countless studies have found that social relationships are the best guaranteed for heightened well-being and lowered stress, both an antidote for depression and a prescription for high performance. So if we do DevOps, what happens is it can help the environment in which people work with. That way, they can get along better. They're not constantly finding problems. They're not like firemen always looking for the next crises. It could reduce the amount of crises and it can focus on delivering value to our customers. And I want to leave you with this. Steve Jobs once said, man as a tool maker has the ability to make a tool to amplify an inherent ability that he has. And that is exactly what we're doing here. We are building tools that amplify a human ability. Here at DASA Connect 2023, this is exactly what we're doing. We're talking to people about how to use DevOps principles and practices. Why? So we can amplify human ability. So we can help people do creative problem solving. Why? So we can help people maximize their potential. Well, thank you so much for joining this session. I have had a wonderful time with you. I hope you join other sessions because I know they are going to be fantastic. And I would love for you to connect with me. Here is my contact information. Please use this QR code. That's my LinkedIn. That's my contact information, as well as it does have a link to my new book I published, Envision Your Future, 7 Ways to Architect the Future and Unleash Potential. Thank you so much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your conference. Look forward to hearing from you soon.